Top 10 gemstones removed from museum collections. They were cataloged, protected, lit behind bulletproof glass, and then one by one they vanished. Not all gemstones disappear into private vaults. Some are removed by the very institutions that once displayed them. Not because they were stolen, not because they were fake, but because the world around them changed quietly, permanently. Across royal treasuries, colonial museums, and national science halls, stones once celebrated as eternal were removed from exhibitions due to theft, war, disputed ownership, or histories no longer deemed acceptable to explain. This is not a list of beautiful gems. This is a record of removal. 10 gemstones that were once on public display, and the real reasons they're gone. Don't forget to press and hold that like button, leave a comment, and hit subscribe before we begin. Ranked 10th. Portuguese Diamond, removed for being too perfect, yet too empty. Among the most technically perfect diamonds ever housed in an American museum, the so-called Portuguese diamond has long stood as a paradox. Dazzling in light, yet almost invisible in meaning. Weighing 127.01 carats and classified as internally flawless, this cushion-cut colorless gem radiates a brilliance so intense that early curators mistook its refraction for fluorescence. And yet, beyond its optical mastery, the stone carries no verified historical lineage. Its name, Portuguese, is demonstrably inaccurate. There is no archival evidence linking it to Lisbon, any Iberian dynasty, or the crown jewels of Europe. The most credible theory traces its emergence to Brazil or South Africa in the late 19th century, though even that remains speculative. What is certain is its 20th century journey through American high society, notably in possession of Peggy Hopkins Joyce, an actress and figure of notoriety whose taste for extravagant gems made headlines long before the diamond ever reached a vault. By 1963, the gem had entered the permanent collection of the Smithsonian Institution, where it was briefly exhibited alongside the Hope Diamond in Washington, D.C.'s National Museum of Natural History. But as the Smithsonian's priorities shifted from showcasing carat weight to preserving cultural narrative, the Portuguese diamond began to feel like a geological orphan. It had no colonial controversy, no criminal past, no ritual significance. And in a gallery increasingly conscious of provenance, that absence became disqualifying. Sometime in the late 1990s, without public notice, the Portuguese diamond was removed from permanent display. Officially, the reasons cited ranged from conservation to rotational curation. Unofficially, it was a matter of relevance. Unlike the Hope, which is entangled in lore, theft, and imperial transfers, the Portuguese diamond told no larger story. For years, it remained absent from public view, housed securely but silently. It occasionally returned in special exhibitions, but never regained a consistent presence. Today, it remains in Smithsonian ownership, cataloged and cared for, but largely unknown to most visitors. In the world of museum curation, the ultimate irony is this: a diamond can be too perfect to cut, too pristine to question, and still too empty to display. Ranked 9th, Moldavite, removed when museums could no longer tell if it was real. Moldavite is not a crystal, not volcanic glass, and not a mineral in the traditional sense. It is impactite, formed by a single confirmed meteorite event that struck southern Germany approximately 15 million years ago, creating the Ries crater and vaporizing surface rock across a region that includes modern-day Czech Republic and Austria. The result was a rare green silica glass, ejected into the air and cooled mid-flight. For decades, its extraterrestrial origin and limited geographical range have made Moldavite a prized addition to museum collections across Central and Eastern Europe. But the properties that made it desirable, its translucent green color, fluid form, and embedded gas bubbles, also made it surprisingly easy to fake. By the early 2000s, counterfeit Moldavite had flooded both metaphysical markets and scientific institutions. Lab-forged variants mimicked its surface etching and even its microscopic structures with enough precision to deceive the naked eye. In some cases, museum samples had been acquired before spectroscopy became standard practice, making authentication retroactive and often inconclusive. The problem wasn't just that fakes existed, it was that the institutions themselves could no longer guarantee the authenticity of what they had. This triggered a quiet, methodical reappraisal. Curators pulled samples from displays for lab review. Some were found to be genuine, others were industrial slag, acid-treated bottle glass, or completely synthetic. In institutions bound to scientific accuracy and public trust, uncertainty alone was grounds for removal. The decision to deaccession wasn't dramatic. There were no thefts, no scandals, and no public denouncements. But the effect was visible. In geology halls from Prague to Brno, Moldavite disappeared from its once prominent glass cases. Even verified samples, when kept, were shifted to educational storage or reserved for specialist access. The mineral that once bridged space science and collector glamour had, ironically, become too unstable to remain on open display, not because it was dangerous, but because too many people had learned how to fake it. Ranked 8th, Black Orlov Diamond, removed when myth became a liability. The Black Orlov Diamond was never actually Russian, and it was never verifiably cursed. Yet for nearly a century it was introduced to museum audiences as both. A 67.5 carat cushion-cut black diamond, technically a polycrystalline carbonado, formed deep within the Earth's mantle. It is one of the rarest natural diamond types ever polished for private display. Its origin remains contested. Most likely it comes from the Central African Republic or Brazil, the only two regions known to produce carbonado. But none of that is what made it famous. What made it famous was the story. According to decades of unverified retellings, the diamond had once adorned a statue of the Hindu god Brahma in an Indian temple, from which it was stolen by a European gem dealer in the 19th century. Afterward, a series of mysterious deaths befell its owners, none officially investigated, none criminally linked, and none verifiable in historical records. Still, the story persisted. It was renamed the Eye of Brahma, then the Black Orlov, and by the mid-20th century, it had passed through the hands of New York jewelers, Russian aristocrats in exile, and at least 2 American heiresses with dramatic lives. In the 1990s and early 2000s, it made appearances at public exhibitions, including brief displays at natural history museums in the US and UK. What museums valued was not just the stone's rarity, but the potential draw of the narrative. But that narrative proved unstable. Unlike the Hope Diamond, whose journey from India to England is thoroughly documented, the Black Orlov had no transparent chain of custody, no archival provenance, and no temple claim of theft. As museum standards around verification tightened and public skepticism toward cursed gem displays increased, curators faced a dilemma. Present the stone with a disclaimer that discredited the very story audiences came to hear, or quietly step away. Most chose the latter. By the end of the 2000s, the Black Orlov had been removed from all major museum displays. Some catalogs delisted it entirely. Others retained it as a reference item but declined to exhibit it further. No public statement was issued. No controversy followed. It was not removed because it was dangerous or fake, but because its legend had become incompatible with the standards of institutional truth. What remains is a rare black diamond, still in private hands, still technically flawless, but stripped of the illusion that once kept it under glass. Ranked 7th, Liddicoatite Tourmaline, removed when ethical sourcing became non-negotiable. Among the most structurally complex gemstones ever displayed at the Smithsonian, Liddicoatite stood out not for brilliance, but for geometry. A rare calcium-rich variety of tourmaline, first recognized as a distinct mineral species in 1977, it is chemically close to L-bate, but defined by an internal atomic lattice that produces radial zoning, natural triangular patterns that look almost mathematically generated. In cross-section, the finest liddicoatite crystals from Madagascar form concentric pink and green triangles, framed by deep brown edges, much like mandalas revealed through the slicing of stone. When the Smithsonian acquired a handful of large, museum-grade liddicoatite specimens from the Anjanabonoina region in central Madagascar, they became anchors of the gem hall, not because of market value, but because they visualized crystal growth in a way that even textbooks could not. For years, the triangular slice drew visitors from mineralogists to school groups, offering a quiet glimpse into the rules nature follows when no one is watching. But by the mid-2000s teens, mineral display was no longer just about chemistry or aesthetics. The ethics of how specimens were sourced, especially from biodiversity-rich and politically unstable regions, became an unavoidable part of curatorial responsibility. Madagascar, long known for its unique tourmaline varieties, had also become a hotspot for environmental violations tied to mining. Reports surfaced of illegal extraction inside conservation zones, forests bulldozed to expose gem-bearing pegmatite, and local communities displaced or economically excluded from the trade. Smithsonian researchers, aware of the institution's role in setting public trust standards, began conducting internal provenance audits on their collections. Most of the tourmaline specimens had been acquired decades earlier, through mineral dealers who could no longer be contacted, or from sources that predated modern ethical acquisition protocols. The Liddicoatite pieces, although geologically significant, were part of that gray zone. Without clear documentation that they had been responsibly sourced, the museum could no longer justify presenting them as neutral educational tools. Quietly, without a public statement or press release, the triangular slices were removed from permanent display, not destroyed or condemned, and simply returned to storage, where they remain cataloged and available for research, but are no longer on view to the public. In their place, newer specimens, those with fully documented ethical acquisition histories, have taken their spot. For casual visitors, the absence goes unnoticed. However, for those who recall the glass case that once held a perfect triangle of color formed over millions of years, the decision marks a subtle shift in institutional values. It reflects a time when natural history museums moved beyond collecting beauty and began curating conscience. Ranked 6th, Eagle Diamond, removed because it was stolen and never returned. It was never meant to be famous. When a farmer's wife found a transparent crystal in a field in Eagle, Wisconsin, in 1876, she thought it was quartz. She sold it for $1 to a local jeweler, who later sent it to Tiffany & Company in New York. Their mineralogist George Frederick Kuntz identified it as a natural diamond, an American diamond, weighing just over 16 carats before it was cut. That fact alone made it geologically significant. Diamonds of natural origin are scarce in the continental United States, and this one had been found loose, above ground, without a known kimberlite source. It was cut into a 14-carat cushion shape and in time became part of the American Museum of Natural History's gemstone collection. It sat quietly in a secured case in the Hall of Minerals and Gems for years, not famous, not cursed, not auctioned, just rare. Then in October 1964, it disappeared. The break-in was meticulous. A group of young men, led by thief Jack Murphy, later known as Murph the Surf, climbed into the museum through an open bathroom window and walked out with more than 24 priceless gems, including the Star of India Sapphire and the Eagle Diamond. Most of the stones were recovered. The Eagle Diamond was not. Authorities believe it was cut into smaller stones and resold anonymously through black market channels. The museum never got it back. What it had been, an unassuming but irreplaceable specimen of U.S. geology, was gone. Its place in the Gem Hall remained empty for a time, then quietly filled with another piece. Unlike most museum removals, which are driven by ethics, policy, or provenance disputes, this one was simple. Theft never solved. For decades afterward, the Eagle Diamond remained listed in museum archives, cataloged as stolen, with no image available and no replica on display. Unlike the Hope or Koh-i-Noor, it left no shadow of fame, just a line in the registry and a hole in the scientific record. What made its loss so consequential wasn't its size or sparkle, but its location. It was a U.S.-sourced diamond, one of the very few ever confirmed to be of U.S. origin. Its absence is more than criminal. It is geological, one data point that can't be replaced. And while the Star of India was retrieved, restored, and reinstalled with armored cases and security upgrades, the Eagle Diamond has remained invisible, unrecovered, and quietly erased from public memory. The American Museum of Natural History no longer displays it, not because of shame or controversy, but because it no longer exists in any form the public can see. It was removed once and for good. Ranked 5th, Libyan desert glass. Removed when science and sovereignty collided. Long before it was labeled or cataloged, Libyan desert glass had already traveled farther than most gemstones ever would. Formed approximately 29 million years ago in what is now the Eastern Sahara, it is the product of a meteorite or high-energy impact event, still debated, capable of melting the desert surface into translucent yellow-green silica. Found scattered across a remote corridor of the Libyan-Egyptian border, this natural glass is older than civilization itself and unlike any volcanic or anthropogenic glass. Its chemistry, devoid of crystalline structure, holds clues about planetary impacts, surface temperatures, and ancient atmospheric conditions. For most of the 20th century, samples of Libyan desert glass were collected under loose colonial-era permissions, often removed by foreign geologists, military survey teams, and academic institutions without the benefit of modern legal frameworks. By the 1990s and early 2000s, pieces had entered the collections of museums in Cairo, London, Paris, Berlin, and New York. At first, they were displayed as scientific marvels, unusual but relatively obscure. That changed when researchers linked a polished specimen of Libyan desert glass to a scarab found in the burial pectoral of Pharaoh Tutankhamun. Suddenly, this unassuming yellow stone had cultural gravity. Its presence in ancient Egypt reframed it not only as a geological artifact, but as a material of spiritual and royal use. That shift brought scrutiny. North African scholars and archaeologists have begun questioning the legitimacy of samples exported during the colonial and early post-colonial periods. Though not classified as a confiscated object under UNESCO conventions, its uncontrolled removal raised ethical concerns, especially in the absence of site documentation, permits, or export records. In Egypt, some samples displayed in regional museums were quietly withdrawn from cases. In Europe, institutions reclassified their holdings as scientific samples, moving them into non-public research collections. And in more than one case, curators acknowledged that they no longer had verifiable documentation on when or how the specimens were acquired. Libyan desert glass was not repatriated, but it was recontextualized. No longer a display object, but a diplomatic liability. The Cairo Geological Museum, which had once shown slabs of the material in open glass cases, relocated them to secure archives. Some museums in Europe removed it preemptively from view, anticipating questions they couldn't yet answer. And so, without fanfare or press release, Libyan desert glass began to disappear. Not because it was unstable, radioactive, or falsified, but because the institutions that once treated it as inert now understood it had a cultural significance. It wasn't just a product of cosmic violence, it was a mirror of how science, empire, and territory intersected. What was once an impactite became an implication, and from a curatorial standpoint, that was reason enough to take it off display. Ranked 4th, Burma Ruby, removed when colonial luxury turned into legal risk. At the height of the British Empire, gemstones didn't arrive in London through trade. They came through conquest. Among the most prized was Burmese ruby, corundum colored by chromium into deep pigeon blood red, mined for centuries in the Mogok Valley of what is now Myanmar. These rubies were unlike any others, saturated, fluorescent under sunlight, and rare even among their kind. When British forces annexed Upper Burma in the 1880s, colonial officers, administrators, and gem traders seized not only territory but also literal treasure. Uncut rubies were removed from palaces, temples, and the vaults of deposed royalty. Some were auctioned, others were quietly absorbed into private collections or sold to jewelers across Europe. By the early 20th century, at least one exceptional Burmese ruby, its provenance unclear, had entered the holdings of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, catalogued not by what it represented, but by its weight. For decades, the museum had displayed it without incident, a fine specimen from the British Empire's global collection. But as the 21st century began, the display no longer felt neutral. Activists, historians, and cultural preservationists have increasingly called attention to the fact that many museum artifacts labeled as colonial were taken without consent or compensation. Burma, now Myanmar, underwent its own political and cultural reckoning, including renewed interest in repatriating stolen heritage. The V&A initiated its internal review, focusing particularly on items acquired before 1947, the year of Indian and Burmese independence. The ruby, although legally acquired by the standards of its time, lacked documentation of a voluntary sale, donation, or excavation. Its chain of custody began only once it reached London. Without proof that it had not been removed under duress, or as a spoil of war, the museum faced a choice: keep it on display and risk public scrutiny, or remove it quietly and preserve institutional flexibility. They chose the latter. Sometime after 2010, the ruby was taken off public exhibition. It remains in the museum's collection, listed in the inventory, but is absent from the gallery walls and online highlights. Inquiries about its status receive vague answers: not deaccessioned, not damaged, simply not currently on display. No official repatriation has taken place, and Myanmar's political instability has complicated any formal dialogue. But its removal is emblematic of a larger shift in curatorial ethics, an acknowledgement that the problem isn't whether an object is beautiful, authentic, or rare. The problem is how it got there. And for one ruby, even in the absence of scandal or lawsuit, that question was enough to dim the lights around it. Not because the museum lost faith in its value, but because it could no longer justify pretending it had no past. Ranked third, Dresden green diamond, removed not by curators, but by war. It was never lost, but for a long time, no one could say where it was. The Dresden green diamond, a 41-carat, naturally green, flawless, Type II diamond, is one of the rarest colored diamonds ever discovered. Likely mined in the Golconda region of India in the early 18th century, it entered the court of Frederick Augustus II of Saxony sometime before 1742, and quickly became the centerpiece of what would later be called the Green Vault collection in Dresden. The gem's color is natural, caused not by trace elements, but by millennia of exposure to radioactive minerals in its host rock. For over 2 centuries, it remained mounted in an elaborate hat ornament, along with more than 400 smaller diamonds, on permanent display in the heart of one of Europe's most opulent royal treasuries. But in 1942, as Allied bombing campaigns intensified across Germany, the vault was closed. The diamond was evacuated, along with hundreds of other objects, to Königstein Fortress, hidden deep in the Elbe Sandstone Mountains. When Dresden was firebombed in 1945, the Green Vault was destroyed, but the contents had already been moved. Soviet forces entered Saxony soon after, and by the end of the war, the Dresden Green was no longer in German hands. It was taken, along with thousands of other artifacts, into the custody of the Red Army's so-called trophy brigades. For nearly a decade, the gem's whereabouts were unknown to the public. It wasn't until 1958, during a cultural thaw, that the Soviet Union returned it to East Germany. Even then, it was not immediately reinstalled. For political reasons, and due to the massive rebuilding of Dresden's museums under the GDR, the green diamond remained in secure storage for years, only emerging in controlled exhibitions. It wasn't until German reunification in the 1990s that it returned to regular display in the newly reconstructed Green Vault, rebuilt to replicate its 18th century form. But diamond's visibility has never been consistent. In 2019, after a dramatic jewel heist targeted the Green Vault and resulted in the theft of multiple royal objects, the Dresden Green was quietly withdrawn again, even though it had not been stolen. It had been out on loan in New York at the time. Since then, security measures have been revised, public access has been restricted, and the Dresden Green is now featured in limited exhibitions only. Officially, it remains part of the museum's crown collection, but its presence is now conditional, governed by diplomatic loans, insurance limitations, and curatorial risk assessments. The Dresden Green Diamond was never removed by policy, protest, or demand for repatriation. It was removed because war forced it underground, and when it returned, the world and its tolerance for public vulnerability had changed. Today, its display is never assumed. Its absence is always possible. Ranked second, Star of India Sapphire, removed after a heist that changed museum security forever. It wasn't just stolen, it was used as a warning. The Star of India, a 563-carat gray-blue star sapphire, is the largest of its kind ever discovered. Its defining feature is an optical phenomenon known as asterism, a six-rayed star that floats across its surface under direct light, caused by needle-like rutile inclusions aligned within the corundum crystal. Unearthed in Sri Lanka over 3 centuries ago, the stone passed through European gem circles before being acquired by financier J.P. Morgan in the early 1900s. He donated it to the American Museum of Natural History in New York, where it became a centerpiece of the Hall of Gems, an emblem of both geological rarity and institutional prestige. But on the night of October 29, 1964, that sense of security shattered. A group of thieves led by Jack Murphy, better known as Murph the Surf, broke into the museum through an unlocked bathroom window and walked out with over $400,000 worth of stones, including the Star of India, the Eagle Diamond, and the D-Long Star Ruby. It was one of the most audacious museum thefts in American history. For days, the public believed the stones were gone forever. Eventually, after a combination of police pressure and internal betrayal, most of the gems were recovered in a Miami bus station locker. But the damage had already been done, not just to the museum's reputation, but to the philosophy of how institutions handled public trust. For a time after the recovery, the Star of India was not returned to display. Security systems were overhauled. Exhibition cases were redesigned with bulletproof glass, motion sensors, and tamper-proof mounts. The museum would never again assume that a stone's size or fame was enough to protect it. Even after the sapphire was returned to the public gallery, it appeared under new terms, behind reinforced layers, monitored at all hours. But its removal didn't end with the 1960s. In later decades, amid building renovations or temporary closures, the Star of India was often among the first stones pulled from the floor. It became a logistical liability, too famous to leave vulnerable, too challenging to ensure without specialized handling. On several occasions, the museum chose to keep it in off-display rotation, showing it only during high-security exhibitions or media events. For those who visit during its absences, no substitute is offered, no replica, no announcement. Its presence is conditional. And while the Star of India remains the property of the museum, its exhibition has become a function of risk management rather than celebration. Unlike many gems removed due to controversy, politics, or provenance, this stone was removed because it taught museums a valuable lesson about the fragility of certainty. The building that was once left is now built around the possibility that it could happen again. In first place, Koh-i-Noor Diamond, removed because no display could outshine its history. It is the only gemstone in the world whose absence draws more attention than its presence. The Koh-i-Noor, Persian for Mountain of Light, is a 105.6-carat diamond of extraordinary clarity, cut into an oval brilliant that has, for over a century, sat at the heart of a controversy larger than empire. Its geological origin is likely the Kolar mine in what is now Andhra Pradesh, India, one of the earliest sources of diamonds anywhere on Earth. But its significance has never been geological. The Koh-i-Noor is a political object, transferred, taken, and recontextualized across dynasties, wars, and national identities. For centuries, it passed between Indian and Persian rulers, including Mughal emperors, Sikh Maharajas, and Durrani kings. Its presence was always conditional, won through invasion, surrendered in conquest, or seized in diplomacy. By the mid-19th century, it had landed in the hands of the British East India Company following the annexation of the Sikh Empire and the forced abdication of the 11-year-old Maharaja Duleep Singh. The diamond was gifted to Queen Victoria in 1850. No record of consent, no public ceremony, just a legal instrument drafted under colonial pressure. From that moment forward, the Koh-i-Noor was no longer a jewel. It was a fault line, set first into a brooch, then recut to enhance brilliance, and eventually mounted into the Queen Mother's crown. It remained part of the British royal regalia for over a century, displayed but never truly explained. Behind museum glass at the Tower of London, it drew millions of visitors. But over time, its visibility became a liability. As India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran each laid claim to it, the museum's silence became part of the problem. Repatriation requests were made, rejected, and revived. Politicians invoked it, diplomatic channels engaged it, and through it all, the diamond stayed, still silent, behind glass. However, in 2002, during preparations for Queen Elizabeth II's death protocol, a decision was made. When the time came, the Koh-i-Noor would not return to public view. In 2023, when the coronation of King Charles III approached, the British royal household quietly removed the Koh-i-Noor from any future crown design. No public announcement. No repatriation. Just absence. Today, the diamond remains in royal possession, technically part of the crown jewels, but withheld from exhibition and ceremony. It is no longer displayed in the jewel house. No photographs are permitted. No exact location is published. It has not been repatriated, but it has been withdrawn. Removed not for reasons of security, fragility, or valuation, but because no modern institution, not even a monarchy, can exhibit it without also displaying everything that came with it. Its brilliance remains but behind closed doors. What's visible now is not the stone, but the silence around it. Some of these stones still exist, in archives, in private vaults, in storage drawers behind locked museum doors. Others are lost for good, but none of them simply disappeared. Each was removed for a reason, scientific, political, ethical, or unspoken. What they left behind wasn't just an empty display case. It was a shift in how we decide what belongs in public view and what doesn't. In an era when history is no longer taken at face value, even gemstones are subject to reevaluation. And sometimes the choice to remove them is the most visible decision a museum can make. Let us know which one resonates with you in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more content like this.